this, another episode of the Quarantine Kitchen. So a couple people requested, well actually my daughter Larissa requested cinnamon rolls, and then a couple other people piped up. So I guess on a gloomy day, what's better than having a little dessert after dinner this evening? And so today we're gonna make cinnamon rolls. Now these are copycat Cinnabon cinnamon rolls from the website Joe Cooks. The blogger is Joanna Cismaro, I believe her name is, and it's quite a bit of there's quite a lot of ingredients. However, it is very, very easy. There's not a lot of kneading, just rolling out and sugar, and then there's a lovely cream cheese icing to go onto the top of them, or you can omit them if you are maybe a little, well, not really lactose, but if you don't want the extra sugar. So it's you're gonna heat up 1 cup of whole milk till it's warm enough to let the yeast bloom for 5 or 6 minutes, but not hot enough that it's over 110 degrees. You're gonna need a 1/2 cup of sugar, 1/3 cup of softened butter or margarine, a pinch of kosher salt, because I use salted butter, so I only use about half of what the salt that they call for, and 2 eggs. Now mine are sitting, if you don't have room temperature eggs, which I prefer because then you'll kill the yeast, I just put 2 eggs into just some warm water just to get them sort of room temperature. That's just what I do, instead of getting them out and leaving them out. So today I am going to use my my mixer, just because the dough comes together a lot, especially when you've only got softened butter. It doesn't mix up quite as nice without it. So in the beginning, I'm going to use a paddle to mix all the sort of wet ingredients, and then we'll switch it over into the dough hook when I start incorporating the flour, and then we're ready to go. Okay, so you're gonna add your sugar first, and then you're gonna add your softened butter. Hopefully it stays pretty soft. Always use a spatula to get out all your ingredients. A pinch of salt. And then you're gonna add your 2 eggs, salt eggs. So your 2 eggs. All at once, it says in the recipe, just to throw it all into your mixer, so not a lot of thought process goes there. And then you're just gonna stir that until it is all incorporated. I always like to do my wet ingredients first before I add any kind of dry ingredients. So the flour is 4 cups of flour, according to the recipe. And then once you've got in all your flour into all of this, then you're going to add your nice warm milk with your yeast bloom. So now I've switched out my dough to my dough hook once I've got all of my wet ingredients incorporated. So I've switched to the dough hook. And I just like to sprinkle in about a cup of flour at a time, sort of giving it a bit of time in between each mixture. You can also use your spatula to sort of scrape it all down at a time. So just until that is all incorporated. So I'm putting in 4 cups of flour. Okay, so this is what your flour and pre-yeast bloom should look like. Sort of just more granulated, very powdery almost. It is a bit incorporated. I usually just break up big chunks so that way it's a little bit easier. All right, and now we're going to add, lock it down, we're gonna add our yeast bloom. Now you really want to make sure that you're turn it up a bit if you have to. You really want to make sure that this is really, really well incorporated. So as you can see, it's still pretty, like it's pretty wet actually, your dough. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna really just scrape all of this right into an oiled bowl and cover until it's doubled in size. So after that, I'll see you then. Okay, so welcome back. Our dough has now risen double in size, and we need to roll it out into a rectangle 16 long by 12 inches wide. So I'm just gonna sprinkle a little bit of dough. Now I'm using a Silpat mat to roll it out, just keep sort of the flour contained with my trusty rolling pin. Speaking of which, my rolling pin has been through many things. Thank you, Mom, for leaving it with me. Now I'm just gonna kind of incorporate it a little bit into the flour. So that way, you know, we got a steady surface, or the ingredients are sort of all incorporated into it. I'm not really kneading it. Just sort of if any of it started to dry on the top, I'm just sort of re-amalgamating it in with one another. So a little bit more flour. And then we're just gonna roll it out. So we're just gonna make it oblong. Now this mat I measured out is about 16 inches long. So I'm just rolling it out as wide as the mat, or as long as the mat, and then not going too far beyond the outskirts of the mat width-wise. It's not quite 12, but it was close enough. So now you can stretch your dough if you're measuring into a rectangle, because you're gonna roll this from long end to towards the other long end to make your rolls, or your spirals or pinwheels. So you're gonna keep rolling it out until you get a really nice sort of as rectangle as you can possibly get. Even if you have to stretch out a bit. Roll, if it's fatter at one side, you roll it towards yourself to flatten it out. And then you kind of keep it all sort of contained. That's not a bad rectangle. And if you have to stretch it out, you can do so. But again, the dough comes together pretty well, especially if you've done the complete rise time. So you've pretty much got a rectangle here. Now the original recipe from Joe Cook's called for just the 1/3 of a cup of softened butter. You spread that on your dough, and then you're gonna mix in your filling. Now I like to melt my butter and spread all of the ingredients on top, because it keeps it a bit more contained as opposed to loose sugar and cinnamon sort of falling out. So what I like to do is I like to take the 1/3 of a cup of the melted butter, and then you're gonna take 3 tablespoons of ground cinnamon. It's a lot, but it's cinnamon rolls. And then you're gonna take a full cup of packed brown sugar. Now I like darker brown sugar because it just gives a nicer flavor. So, and if you don't have brown sugar at home, you can actually make your own if you've got molasses and regular granulated sugar. You just need either a food processor or a blender, and then you can sort of eyeball it to you get this nice sort of moist consistency, and however dark you want to make it. So you're going to incorporate that into there. And then now I like my small whisk because it just mixes it kind of all in, tapping it a bit. And the sooner you get this mixed and the more liquidy, I guess, for me anyway, it stays, the better kind of it spreads. So this is what it's supposed to look like. All right, for you know, for the recipe that I do. I sort of altered it. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a spreader. Now you can do this with a regular spatula as well. I prefer using an icing spreader just because it has a better consistency. And as much to the corners as you can get, or to the sides of it, you're gonna spread your filling. The shorter time you leave your butter that's been melted, the better. And it does spread a lot nicer than just putting butter on the dough and then sprinkling and trying to get it all even. I prefer doing it this way much better. Really try and get to your corners and the sides because you don't want your cinnamon buns at the end of the roll to not have any of the mixture. All right, so that's pretty even. You want to make sure it's pretty flat, edge to edge, as much as you possibly can without any big lumps or chunks. All right, and now we're ready to roll. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna take the very edges, and if you want, you can stretch it out, and you're gonna, the tiniest of rolls inwards in the center, because you really wanna try and get it all compact and not a lot of space in between each of your rolls. So if you can do it very nicely and very fluidly, you can just roll it, and it's pretty even. And you just keep rolling until you get to the edge. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna turn it, or bring it over here, because it's very heavy at this point now. And then you're gonna do this. So now we've got a full edge. So what you're gonna do, pinch these together. It should pinch quite lovely. It's pretty sticky still. And then flatten it on the edge. So you've got a pretty good dough here. It's all nice and compact. And then what you're gonna do, so because I don't have a ruler or my kids have stolen them, you're gonna wanna make your about 1.5 inches each. So I just take a regular serrated blade because it cuts the nicest. So you're gonna want 1.5 inches in length, and you're just gonna make little indentations where the 1.5 inch mark is. So from there, because you don't want too big, but you don't want too small for that. And you're just gonna go along at 1.5 inches every bit. And then once we're done, I'll show you how to put them in your grease pan. Okay, so I've cut all my dough at the 1.5 inch mark. And this is what your dough should look like when you pick up one of the rolls. Now it's already starting to rise again because you're not handling it so much, and it's warm in this kitchen today. So if you don't have a 13x9 glass baking dish, you can use a regular cookie sheet with sort of a lip around it. Now I wouldn't recommend doing a flat one, but one that's got, you know, a little bit of a lip on it. Put some parchment paper down so that way they don't stick. And then you're just going to arrange your dough as much as you can. Now I ended up getting 9 rolls out of this particular roll. You could probably get smaller rolls if you wanted smaller ones, but I do what Joe does, and I do 1.5 inches. Now what you're gonna do is you're gonna let these rise even further than they were, and about double in size again. Now you can space these out as much as you can so that way they have that space to rise. But you should be able to look like this. If you want to scatter them, you can do that, or stagger them, I should say, so that way they have enough time to rise. But they really will fill in most of the space altogether anyway. I'll see you when they, I believe it calls for about 30 minutes to rise again. So it's really not a long time from now. About 30 minutes, they should rise enough to be able to put in the oven at 350 degrees if you're on non-convection. I highly recommend, if you're using convection, reduce your heat by 25 minutes for most of your baking recipes, just because it cooks it too fast, and that's probably maybe why you're baking sort of browns quicker than it should. So I use at 325 for most of my baking here at the house, and usually things turn out pretty okay. So I guess I'll see you in 30 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 30 minutes, and this is what your bun should look like at this point in time. I left mine probably 35 because I thought the end piece was just a little tiny, but it's all gonna rise a little bit more in the oven anyway. So I've got my convection oven set to the temperature of 325. It is preheated. So I'm gonna put these in the oven, and then we're gonna go through the icing. Again, you don't have to have the icing, you can just have those, or you can do a little bit of milk if you just want them a little bit glazed. You can do milk and powdered sugar just until it's a nice sort of glossy consistency, and just drizzle over it if you want just an extra little bit of sweetness. But we're gonna throw these in the oven, and then we'll get started on our cream cheese frosting. So while those are in the oven for about 20 minutes, I check them, especially if you've got convection, because sometimes some run hotter than others. I would check them around 18 or 19 minutes, and you may even need 22 minutes. I usually set them for about 20, and then usually until they're about nice golden brown color. Don't get them any darker than sort of a light brown sugar color, I guess. So for the icing, we're gonna use, it's a 1/4 cup of cream cheese, so not a lot of cream cheese. And it calls for 6 tablespoons of butter. Now use real butter if you can, just because it has a better consistency to mix with cream cheese. So it says 6 tablespoons, but I broke it down, and it is a 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons. So that was a little bit easier to measure out rather than the time constraint of measuring out 6 tablespoons. So we're gonna mix that together. Now I do this with a hand mixer, just because it's always a little smoother, and because it's such a little amount really. So you're gonna mix that all in until it's really, really blended. And then you're gonna put in a teaspoon of vanilla. And you don't want any more than what it calls for. Actually, it's only half a teaspoon, I'm sorry. So it's a half a teaspoon of vanilla. And you don't want any more liquid in there, or your icing will be too runny. You can scrape down a bit so that way it's all at the bottom. And then you're gonna take 1.5 cups of powdered sugar, or icing sugar, or confectioner sugar. And you're just gonna have it on, sort of light until you incorporate little bits at a time. You can turn it up a little bit, but I would just do this gradually until you've got it all mixed in. Now, of course, you want the butter slightly softened, but not really warm at all. You just want it softened to room temperature, or again, your icing will be really, really too soft, and it won't solidify at all. So you want it in a really nice, and scrape it as you go. So you're putting that in higher as you go, because it starts getting a little thicker. I usually do it in thirds usually. And then what you can do is you can turn your mixer up, kind of stirring it all around a little bit. If you can, switch hands if you're so inclined to do, or you can stop and just mixing it in a little bit, just like that. And then you're really gonna want, what I do, just so it gets nice and light and airy, I usually whip it a little bit. So you should have a really nice whipped consistency, and wait for your buns to come out of the oven, and then we'll show you how to spread that. Now, when you take your rolls out of the oven after 20 minutes of golden brown, let them sit for at least 5 or 6 minutes so they're not piping hot. You still want them warm enough that the icing will spread, but not piping hot so that it all sort of melts into the rolls either. So we'll be back. Okay, so 20 minutes are up. Your cinnamon rolls should look this nice and golden. Now they've been out for about 5 minutes already, because I don't like them, like I said, I don't like them piping hot when you put your icing on, just because it melts the crap out of it. So just set that there. And you can take a spatula as well, or if you have a spreader, that even works a little bit better. But you're just gonna like top one little pat of your icing on each of your cinnamon rolls. Let it kind of soften up. Now I pre-cut mine also, so I kind of separate them so that way when you lift them out, because it's in a baking dish, that way you can get individuals rather than pulling them all apart. I just sort of separate them all a little bit. Okay. And then you just kind of like, you can swirl it. Now you can also use a smaller one, which I also have. And you're just spreading a little bit of that icing all around. So here's the finished product, all glazed or iced, and they're still hot, which is why I'm still wearing oven mitts. Special mention goes to joecooks.com, Joanna Sismaru, who blogs all of her recipes. So thank you very much, Jo Cooks, and thanks everybody for watching Quarantine Kitchen.